The light over the pole barn died at 11:40 that night, and I stood in the dark, counting the seconds it took my eyes to adjust, because that was a habit, and habits were how a man stayed useful when the power went and the cold came in under the door. I had wired that light myself. I knew the breaker, knew the run of conduit from the panel to the gable end, knew there was nothing between the panel and the bulb that should have failed on a still November night. There was no wind. There was no ice on the line. The light had simply stopped, the way a thing stops when something stands between it and you, and I waited there, with my hand on the cold steel of the barn door, and listened. And the thing I heard first was the thing that was missing. The dogs were not barking. We had two of them, a heeler mix named Tuck and an old shepherd named Bly, and they barked at the propane truck, at the mailman, at deer crossing the lower field, at the wind itself some nights. They were not barking now. They were under the porch. I could hear the small scrape of a collar tag against a board, the way Bly pressed himself flat when a storm came that the rest of us could not yet feel. I had lived on that ground for 19 years, and I knew the sound of my own dogs hiding, and it set something in my chest before I had any reason for it. My name is Adrian Voss. I run a small operation off the county road, 40 acres of pasture and timber that had been my father's and his father's before that, and I keep beef cattle and a few horses, and I do equipment repair for the dairies up the valley. I am not a man who tells stories. I measure things. I keep a tape in my coat pocket and a carpenter pencil behind my ear most days, and when somebody asks me how far it is to the back fence, I tell them the number, not a guess. My wife Rena used to say I would measure my own coffin, and complain the box ran long. That was the kind of thing we said to each other in the warm part of our life before the cold part, and I am telling you this so you understand what kind of man stood at that barn door, because what I am going to tell you needs a man you can trust telling it. I had spent that whole day fixing a manure pump for a dairyman named Sutter up the valley, lying on my back in the cold, with the impeller housing apart on a tarp and grease working into the cracks of my knuckles. And I had driven home in the last of the light with the radio off because I think better with it off. That is the kind of day it was. An ordinary day, a worked day, a day with a number of hours in it that I could account for. I had eaten the supper. Rena kept warm, and I had stood at the sink and looked out at the yard the way I did every night, checking the shapes of things, the gate, the truck, the dark line of the timber, and everything had been where it belonged. There is a comfort in a thing being where it belongs, that a man does not notice until the night a thing is not. I had gone out to the barn at 11:30 to throw a flake of hay to the horse that colicked easy in the cold, and I had been standing in the aisle smelling the good smell of hay and horse and cold concrete when the light died, and I want you to understand that nothing in that day had prepared me for it, that I came to it out of the most ordinary day a man can have, with grease still under my nails and the taste of coffee gone stale in my mouth. The breaker for that light was the third one down in the panel, and I knew it the way I knew the back of my own hand, because I had stood in front of that panel 100 times with a flashlight in my teeth, tracing a fault. A breaker trips for a reason. A bulb burns for a reason. A line shorts for a reason, and the reason leaves a mark, a scorch, a green corrosion at a junction, a place where the insulation has gone brittle and cracked. I am a man who finds the reason. That is the whole of my trade, and most of my character. And standing in the dark of the barn that first night, I already knew, before I had walked to the panel, that I was not going to find a reason, because the dark had a quality to it that a simple power failure does not have, a held quality, a quality of attention. And I had felt that quality maybe twice before in my life, and both times there had been a large animal close that I had not yet seen. We had the baby by then. Wren was 4 months old that November, and she slept in the room off the kitchen, the one with the window that looked out at the tree line where the pasture gave way to the timber. Wrenna had hung a mobile of little felt birds over the crib, and there was a sleep sack printed with foxes that she wore those cold nights. And I mention these things because they are the things I was thinking about while I stood in the dark. A man does not stand at a dead light at 11:40 at night and think about breakers for very long. He thinks about the window off the kitchen. I got the light back the hard way, with a headlamp and the spare bulb from the shop. And the bulb was good. The socket was good. The breaker had not tripped. When I threw it, the light came on like nothing had happened, and it threw its yellow circle out across the gravel and stopped at the edge of the dark the way it always did. I stood in that circle and I looked at the line where the light ended and the timber began, and I did not see anything. That is the truth. I want to be careful with the truth in this. I did not see anything that first night. I only felt the wrongness of a quiet that should not have been quiet. And I told myself it was a marten on the line, or a limb across the wire that had since fallen clear. And I went inside. In the morning, the frost was down hard and even, and that was when I found the first one. I had gone out to break ice on the stock tank, the way I did every cold morning, and the path from the house to the tank ran along the fence line at the edge of the timber. The ground there was soft from the autumn rains, and then locked by the frost, which is the best register a man could ask for, better than snow, because frost holds an edge. And in that frost, pressed into the mud and rimed white around its borders, was a track. I want to tell you what I do when I find a track, because it matters. I do not jump, I crouch. I look at the whole of it before I look at any part. I put my own hand down beside it for scale, and I take the tape out of my coat, and I lay it across the width and the length, and I read the numbers off and I hold them in my head. This track was 11 inches from heel to the front of the toe pads. It was 7 inches across the widest part. It was deep, deeper on the front edge than the back. The way a print goes deep when weight is thrown forward when a thing is moving and not standing. It had 4 toes, and it had claws, and the claws were not retracted the way a cat's would be, and they were not the small, neat points of a dog. They were long and they were set forward, and there was a span between the toes that was wrong, that was too wide, that did not match anything I had laid a tape across in 19 years of walking. That ground, I told myself, bare. A black bear's hind track can run 11 inches, and a bear walks with its weight forward, and a bear has claws. I told myself bare, and I stood up to walk it off, to follow the line of them across the frost, and find where they came down out of the timber and where they went. Because a bear leaves a trail a man can read, a bear blunders, a bear knocks the rime off the grass and breaks the small ice in the low spots. And I followed the tracks, and they did not do any of that. They came out of the timber clean, they crossed 40 feet of open frost to the fence line. And at the fence they did not climb, and they did not go under. And the next track was on the other side of the fence, 4 feet of frosted wire between them, and the grass between was not broken, and the rime on the top wire was not smeared, and I stood there with my tape in my hand, because a bear does not clear a 4-foot fence from a standing stop and land in stride. I want to tell you what I did then, because it is the kind of thing that separates a man who knows his ground from a man who is scaring himself. I went back to the first track in the timber, and I worked the whole line of them a second time, slower, on my hands and knees where I had to be, reading the gait. The stride between the tracks was the thing that finished me. A bear of the size to leave an 11-inch print walks with maybe a 30-inch stride a little more at a lope. These tracks were set 4.5 feet apart, heel to heel, in a steady walk. No run in them, no gather and spring. Just a long, even-reaching walk that ate the ground the way nothing on 4 legs that size moves. And then in two places I found and marked with sticks pushed into the frost. The gait changed, the 4-print walk became 2 prints. The thing had risen up off its front and gone on its hind legs, for a span of yards, and then come back down to all 4. And the 2-legged prints were deeper at the heel, and the stride of them was longer still. And I knelt in the frost with my own measured sticks, standing up around me like a surveyor's flags, and I understood that I was reading the track of something that walked both ways. That chose, the way a man chooses, when to go upright and when to go down. And I have read a great many tracks in my life, and I had never read a sentence like that one written in the ground. I went back to the house, and I did not say bear to Rena. I said I found some big tracks and I wanted to get a picture before the frost let go, and I went back out with my phone, and I photographed them with the tape laid across for scale. And I hated how the phone made them look small and ordinary, how the screen flattened a thing the cold ground had made enormous. The pictures were no good. I knew they were no good when I took them, and I took them anyway, because a man wants a record, because evidence is the thing you reach for when the world stops making the shape you expected. I called the county that afternoon. I am putting this in because it is part of what happened, and because I want you to understand that I did the things a reasonable man does. I called the sheriff's dispatch, and I told them I had a large animal coming up close to the house, and I had stock and a baby, and I wanted somebody to know. The woman on the line was kind, and she was useless, not through any fault of hers, but through the simple fact that there is no box on her form for what I had. She asked me what kind of animal, and I stood there in my own kitchen with the phone warm against my ear, and I found I could not answer her, because the only honest answer was that I did not know. And a man calling the law to say, there is a thing at my house, and I do not know what it is. Here's how he sounds before he has finished the sentence. She said she would note it. She said, if I saw the animal, I should call back. She said they could send a deputy out, but a deputy was 40 minutes away on a good night, and there were 2 of them covering the whole east half of the county. I thanked her. I understood. I have been the man who is 40 minutes away from the thing that needs doing now. I know that the help does not come in time. That is not a complaint. It is just the arithmetic of living where we live. And I had chosen the arithmetic, had chosen it gladly, had wanted exactly this distance from other men for the whole of my adult life, until the night I stood in my kitchen and felt how thin the distance made me. The second night, the dogs would not come out from under the porch at all. I carried their food out to them, and Bly would not eat, and Tuck ate with his belly pressed to the boards and his eyes on the tree line. And I crouched there with them in the cold, and I looked where they were looking, and I saw nothing. The light over the pole barn held that night. Around 2 a.m, Rena woke me with her hand flat on my chest, not shaking me, just pressing, the way you press a thing to keep it still. And she said in a voice I had not heard her use, low and even and entirely awake, that something was outside the baby's window. I went into Wren's room without the light. The window off the kitchen looked out at the tree line, and the moon was down, and the glass was a black rectangle, with the faint shape of the felt birds hanging still in front of it. I stood to the side of the window the way you stand when you do not want to be a shape against the room. And I looked out at the dark, and I let my eyes do the slow work they had done at the barn door. And the dark resolved itself into the gray of frosted pasture and the black wall of the timber. And there at the edge where the 2 met. 2 at a height that was wrong, were 2 points of amber. They were not down low, where an animal's eyes belong. They were up higher than my own eyes, higher than the top rail of the fence, and they were steady. That is the thing I keep coming back to. They were not the bright, startled flash of an animal caught and frozen. They did not waver and they did not blink in the skittish way a deer's will. They held. They held on the window, on the room behind the window, on the crib I knew was 3 feet to my left in the dark, and the holding of them was the most deliberate thing I have ever seen a pair of eyes do. It was not looking. It was reading. It was taking the measure of the room, the way I take the measure of a track. And I understood, standing there in the cold with my daughter asleep 3 feet away, that I was being studied by something that studied, and that the wrongness I had felt since the light died, it was the wrongness of a mind where no mind should be. I did not move and the eyes did not move, and we held there the glass between us for a length of time I cannot truthfully give you in minutes, because time stopped being a thing I was counting. And then they were gone. Not turned away. Gone the way the light over the barn had gone, between one breath and the next, with no sound of a body moving off through frosted grass that should have crackled under any weight at all. I stood at the window until the cold had gone all the way into my hands, and then I went, and I sat in the kitchen, with the shotgun across my knees. And I did not sleep, and that was the second night. In the morning, there were tracks under the window. 4 of them, set close, the way a thing stands when it has stopped and settled its weight to watch, and the depth of them in the frost-locked mud told me the weight that had stood there was greater than mine. And I am not a small man. I measured them. I photographed them. I built a small ring of flour around the clearest one, the way my grandfather had taught me to set a register for a track you wanted to read again. And I told myself I would see if anything came back to it. And then I did the thing I had been putting off. I called the state, the conservation department, the wildlife officers, because the sheriff's deputy has no business with tracks. But a conservation officer reads sign for a living, and I thought, if I bring this to a man whose whole job is animals, the name will give me a fence to put around it. His name was Officer Del Mara, and he came out the following afternoon in a green state truck, a big, calm man, maybe 10 years older than me, with the unhurried way of a man who has spent his life outdoors. I liked him on sight. I want that on the record, too, because of what came after, because I do not want you to think I am telling you a story about a fool or a coward. He was neither. He was a competent man, and he knew his country, and when I walked him out to the fence line and showed him the tracks crossing the open frost, he crouched the way I crouch. He looked at the hole before the part, and I stood back and let him work, because that is the courtesy you give a man who knows his trade. He had the kind of hands that had done outdoor work for a living, thick and scarred across the knuckles. And he handled the frost-locked ground gently, the way you handle a thing you do not want to disturb before you have learned what it has to tell you. He measured the width with his own tape, and I watched him read the number off, and I watched his lips move on it without sound. He looked at the 4-foot gap at the fence where the trail went over clean, and he stood up and looked at the fence for a while, and then he looked back at the line of tracks coming out of the timber, and I saw him do the same arithmetic I had done. He found my marker sticks where I had flagged the 2-legged stretch, and he crouched there a long time. He asked me, without looking up, if I had moved anything, if I had set those sticks before or after I found the change in the gate. And I told him after, told him I marked what I found and did not touch the prints. He walked the line of them out to the timber and back. He crouched at the prints under the baby's window for a long time, longer than he had spent on any of the others, and he put his hand down in the frost next to the deepest of them, and he held it there, and I saw something move across the back of his shoulders, a kind of stillness that came into him, and when he stood up, he did not have his easy face anymore. I asked him what it was. I asked him straight, the way one practical man asks another. I said, "Is that a bear? And I want you to give it to me straight, because I have a baby in that room." And Officer Mara looked at the track, and then he looked out at the timber for a while, and then he looked at me, and he did not say bear, he did not say cougar, he did not say any of the names I had laid out for him to choose from like tools on a bench. He said in a voice that had gone quiet and careful that I should take my family and go stay with somebody for a few nights. He said it the way you say a thing you have decided not to explain. I asked him again what it was, and he stood up, and he folded his tape and he put it in his pocket, and he told us to go home except this was our home. And what he meant, what he was telling me without telling me, I pushed him. I am not a man who lets a thing go unmeasured, and he had measured it and would not give me the number. I said, "You've seen something like this before." It was not a question. He looked at me a moment, and then he looked away, out at the timber, and he was quiet long enough that I thought he would not answer at all. And then he said that in 26 years he had seen tracks twice that he did not write up because there was no line on the form for them, and because writing them up did a man no good. And he said both times the people who lived there had moved within the year. And he said it like a man telling you the one true thing he has, and being ashamed it is not more help than it is. I asked him where, what places, and he said the names of 2 creeks I knew, both of them back in country as empty and as old as mine. And he said the families that had left them did not talk about why. He gave me his cell number, which he said he did not give out. He wrote it on the back of a department card with a stub of pencil, and he pressed it into my hand and closed my fingers over it the way you do with a thing you want a man to keep. He told me to call him if it came back and not to wait for dispatch. And then he got in his green truck and he sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel, not starting it, looking at my house and my barn and the tree line behind them. And then he drove out my lane, and I stood in the yard and watched the dust of him settle. And I have never in my life felt as alone as I felt watching a man whose whole job was to know what walks these woods drive away from my house, without telling me what was walking up to it. We did not go. I want to be honest about that because the not going is the hinge the rest of it turns on. Rena wanted to go. She stood in the kitchen with Ren on her hip, and she said we could be at her sister's in 2 hours. And I looked at the 40 acres my father had bled into, and the cattle that would not feed themselves, and the simple, stubborn arithmetic of a man who has never run from a thing in his life. That was the mistake. I know it was the mistake. I have laid awake more nights than I can count laying my own reasoning across the frost like a tape and reading the wrongness of it. A man does not see the mistake from inside it. From inside it, I was being careful. From inside it, I was being the man who measures twice. I did the things I knew how to do. I moved the cattle up to the near pasture, where I could see them from the house, walking them up in the last light with Bly limping along at my heel, because he would not stay under the porch with me out in the open, and the cattle moved wrong, bunched and quick, lifting their heads at the timber the way cattle do. At the smell of something, they have a deep old reason to fear. I set my grandfather's old lever rifle by the door and the shotgun in the kitchen, and I checked the loads on both like bolts in a checklist. I laid out shells on the windowsill in a row and counted them twice, and the counting was a thing to do with my hands more than a thing that needed doing. I put new bulbs in every outside fixture, and I ran an extension to a work light on the gable end of the house that threw a hard white wash across the yard to the tree line, and I stood under it when it was lit and looked at how far it reached and where the dark began. I bought a trail camera from the farm store in town, a good one, the kind the hunters use, and I hardwired it to face the window off the kitchen, because if a thing was going to stand at my daughter's window and read the room, I wanted a record better than my phone. There. Tell me that, has a name. I tested it 3 times in the failing light, walked into its frame, and watched the little red eye of it wake and hold on me, and I told myself it was a good camera, and it would not miss, and I believed it. Because I had not yet learned the size of what I was trying to photograph. The flower ring at the fence was disturbed when I checked it that evening. Not smeared, not blundered through. There was a single clear print pressed into the center of the ring, dead center. Set down with care inside the circle I had laid, and around it the flower was undisturbed. And I stood there in the failing light and understood that the thing had stepped into the middle of my register and set its weight down clean, and lifted it out again, and that it had done so the way a man steps over a snare. He has seen, knowing exactly what it was and what it was for. I did not tell Rena about the flower ring. I told myself I was sparing her. The truth is, I could not say out loud what the flower ring meant, because what it meant was that the thing knew it was being measured and had let me measure it, had stepped into my circle to tell me it knew. And there is no rational explanation that survives a thing leaving you a message in flower. The 3rd night it came for the light. I was awake. I had decided I would be awake every night until the trail camera gave me something with a name, and I was sitting in the kitchen with the shotgun and the work light throwing its whitewash across the yard, and at 2:12 the whitewash died. Not flickered. Died. All at once, the way the pole barn light had died the first night, and I was on my feet before the dark had finished closing. And I had the headlamp in my hand, but I did not turn it on, because a light is a thing that tells the dark where you are. I stood in my own kitchen in the absolute black, and I listened. And the house was silent, and then from the gable end, where the work light had been, from the high place where I had clamped it 8 feet up the wall, there came a sound. I have tried for a long time to describe this sound to people, and I have mostly stopped trying, because the words make it smaller than it was. It was low. It started below the bottom of what I could properly hear, and I felt it in the floor and in my teeth before I heard it. A bass rumble like the idle of a diesel 3 fields off, and laid over the top of that rumble was a second sound, a fast shattering vibration, dry and rapid, like something working that did not belong in the same throat as the rumble. 2 sounds in one source. A bottom and a top that no animal I know makes together, and it came from 8 feet up the wall, from the height where I had clamped the light, which meant the thing making it had reached up to the light, had taken the light, was standing at the wall of my house at a height a thing should not reach, telling me in the only voice it had that the light was a thing it could take whenever it chose. And then it stopped, and the silence after it was worse. And into that silence, thin and electronic, and coming from the baby monitor on the counter 3 feet from my hand, came the same sound. The rumble and the chatter, smaller, filtered, transmitted, coming through the little speaker from the receiver in Wren's room, which meant the thing had moved, in the span of the silence, from the gable end of the house to the window off the kitchen, had crossed in seconds a distance that should have taken a body crashing through the frozen yard, and was now at the glass beside my daughter's crib, close enough that the monitor on her wall had caught its voice and carried it to me on the counter. I have never moved as fast as I moved then. I remember being at the door of her room with the shotgun up and a headlamp on and the beam swinging across the crib and finding her there, asleep, the felt birds still, the foxes on her sleep sack rising and falling with her breath, and the window beyond her a black rectangle with frost beginning to flower at its corners, and Dawn, the other side of the glass. I stood over her crib until dawn. I did not move, and I did not lower the gun for a long time, and Rena came and stood in the doorway with her hand pressed white-knuckled on the frame, and neither of us said anything because there was nothing left to say that the sound through the monitor had not already said. When the light finally came up, gray and